You're listening to Hear This Idea, a podcast showcasing new thinking from the University of Cambridge and beyond. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Carolina Alves, who is the Joanne Robinson Research Fellow in Heterodox Economics at Girton College. We asked Carolina to explain to us what heterodox economics is, how it can clash with mainstream economics, and what this debate means for discussions of the economy. Carolina is also a co-founder of DECON, the Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics initiative. The second part of our conversation is learning about the challenges that DECON face in creating an academic field that is more inclusive in terms of gender, race, and the global south. This episode does sometimes get a little bit in the weeds, so for listeners new to economics, we recommend you take a look at the write-up if you ever feel lost. There we explain all the topics in great detail and have links to further readings as well. That said, we think this episode could be very useful for non-economists too. One of the points that I found most interesting in our conversation was how different debates of economics and the economy can actually be. A lot of political policies rely on economic models for legitimacy, so it is absolutely worth understanding what assumptions these models rely on, even if they can get a bit tricky at times. Also, almost every academic field is grappling with these huge questions of decolonizing and diversity at the moment, so listeners will almost certainly be able to find some useful parallels to apply to their own studies. Just one quick housekeeping point, we're still recording episodes remotely and actually had to re-record a short clip at around the 40-minute mark. Hence, there is a little bit of a change in how Carolina's mic sounds. But without any further ado, here's the episode.
My name is Carolina Alves. I am the Joanne Robinson Research Fellow in Heterodox Economics at Girton College at University of Cambridge.
Out of interest, what made you choose economics?
Every time I come across this question, it's almost like a soul-searching process to find out what really happened. And the more I think about it, the more confirmed actually my initial answer, which was a mix between my mom's views on the Brazilian politics at the time, in a context where we are experiencing very high inflation, often like double-digit monthly inflation in Brazil. So of course I grew up in that environment with my mom always criticizing the government regarding to that. And I have memories of going to the supermarket, and buying, 10 packs of rice, 20 packs of beans and everything. When was the payment day, we had to go to the supermarket and buy everything for the entire month into the next payday. And I think this is always in my memory regarding, the idea of money, price, inflation that has always in my mind since I was little. And that comes together many, questions regarding many social issues as well that I thought around me with in my family. So I think by the time I was really going to the library during the equivalent year of your sixth form, I was okay. What am I gonna do? What am I gonna do? And when I read the description about economics, whoever wrote that description was spot on because everything I wanted to know was there. So I thought, gosh, I think I want to do economics. And it was a bit of a conflict, actually, because I come from a town in Brazil that is known because of two of the best universities in Brazil. Your field of expertise is physics and engineering. So to come to my mom in the 1990s and say, oh, I'm going to do economics was like, what? How? How are you going to do that? But as I really got into this course and the BA in economics, I realized that that's what I wanted. And it was interesting because my mom was very into politics. She is still into politics. At the time, she was a member of the Labour Party in Brazil. I think she still is. So we started having a very interesting new, it's like if we developed a new relationship between us in that kind of political, social and economic political aspect of society.
How did you come to heterodox economics then? What was your kind of journey to that?
It's interesting. As I said, when I chose economics, the next step was to choose which university you're going to go, right? I think it's very similar in UK now that I'm more familiar with that. And at the time in Brazil, we had like three top universities you could go to do economics, and it was very clear that one of them was very mathematized, the other one was very into development, and the third one was something more like history of economics, no, economic history actually, and development. I wasn't, to be very honest, I just wanted to get into the university. I wasn't really being picky, but yeah, I did actually end up being accepted in that university where the focus was economic history and development. And I had a very interesting journey there because it was a very, nowadays I look, and it was a very heterodox undergrad, even for Brazilian standards. And I was very lucky as well because I'm from a generation. Probably I'm going to give away my age now, where we didn't use textbooks. Right, I never had economics with textbooks, and actually doing my undergrad, we are fighting against the Ministry of Education in Brazil that was trying to implement textbooks come from the U.S. into the majority of the BAs in Brazil, and we actually, the students are getting organized to resist that. Of course we lost the battle, but was very interesting. So I remember, for example, my last year I had international economics, and was the first year where all these textbooks, they were introduced to BAs in my university. And I look back and I think my professor teaching international economics wasn't happy either, because we are reading, things such as Fred Block, origins of the international economic disorder, which is an amazing book you guys should read. We were reading like amazing books regarding all these Bretton Woods kind of these institutions, and then all this was replaced by the international economics by Krugman, Krugman in Oxford. So it's like if you had like a reading list with probably, I don't know, 20 books, and then you get to one manual. And so I think also that has not really relying on manuals had a huge impact in my education as an economist. I remember having macro, reading Keynes, reading Kaletsky, reading Marx. I mean, see, this my macroeconomics undergrad was module was amazing. So I think this, as I said, but I've never really discussed if I was a heterodox economist or not. But I knew this divide was there, and by the time I decided to do a master, this became very clear because I knew the kind of topic I wanted to research wouldn't really find a place in a normal department of economics. So I went, at the time I was very clear I wanted to do an MPhil, and I knew I wouldn't get in. The topic I wanted to study, it wouldn't be accepted in the normal department of economics. And that's why I moved to sociology. And so that's when I realized there is a divide, a very clear divide in economics. But up to then, I was fine. And it wasn't until when I got in UK, so was to do the PhD, where the term heterodox economics, it became very clear that I need to know what was it, and that I was one in a way. And then it started, because as I said, I knew about this Latin American structuralist thought, which is called by Latin Americans, a heterodox approach to development. But I've never had thought in terms of heterodox economics. It wasn't until I got here that I realized that I was one, and that divide was important. I think up to when I was in Brazil, I didn't really. It was more a division between economics that does math, economics that doesn't do math, something very vulgar. And when I got here, I realized it was much more complex.
And that kind of leads me on to the first question I wanted to ask, which is, what do you think economics is as a discipline? Like, what is it studying and what is its purpose?
Yeah, I mean, to be very honest, it's very easy to identify ourselves with economics, right? Regardless if we know what the topic is, because we look around how we organize society, and many of the questions we start asking sometimes at a very early stage in our life, they're somehow related to economics. And I think, as I just described, that's what happens to me. And if you go to the literally to the meaning of the word, is that what is saying to us, how we organize our house, our home? And so I think economics is basically about us, is about the social world, is about looking around and see how we can make society better. And I know this is very cliche, but I'm kind of siding here with something that a Gretonian economist that was contemporary of John Robinson used to really push forward, that economics should be about social betterment. We have to look around and see how we can live, for everybody better conditions. Of course, this is a very probably ideal way to understand economics. When we start our BA, as you both know by now, we kind of face a very different idea of what economics is and how economics is taught, which is a different kind of question in a way. But for me, that's how I see economics. That's why I'm still very passionate about economics. And perhaps that's why I start kind of moving away from what we call mainstream economics, siding a little bit, which, we're going to discuss that probably, but this kind of heterodox economics, because I do identify myself with economics that is more social.
So let's unpack that just now, which is this idea of heterodox economics. So we've talked a little bit about what economics is as a discipline and what we might hope it achieves. What is heterodox economics in this concept?
I think there are so many, scholars trying to work it out what heterodox economics is, and I did kind of start that journey as well. Look, to be very honest, I've been working with a colleague in Alma, that's Ingrid Kavan-Graven, who is based in New York, and we're trying literally to come up with a definition of heterodox economics, which everybody look at us and say, why? There are so many definitions out there. But we're really seeing that as a strategic moment, that if you want to improve the discipline and have a discipline that actually will help us to improve society, to make to produce better living conditions for everybody, we need to somehow have a definition of heterodox economics that brings different streams of economics together. So right now for us, we are trying to move away from I would say narrow definition of economics, which is that we are used to in our own BAs and in masters and PhDs, which is the idea that economics is about studying this allocation of scarce resources and looking for the best allocation and so on. And of course, we know, and probably can discuss more about about this, how what the implications of such idea of economics when it comes to methods and theory. So, but let's leave that on the side. So that's the definition that's out there. And what Ingrid and we want to do is to trying to have a kind of economics which we call heterodox economics, that's more concerned about the study of production and distribution of what is produced in economy, of this economic surplus. And we're not reinventing the wheel in a way. This goes back to many classic economists that were also understanding the economy that way. So we want to do that. So basically we want to say, okay, is the study of production, is the study of distribution, where else, so we want to make clear that kind of approach will bring into the center the idea of power relations. When we are understanding that production and distribution, we want to bring to the discussion the idea that there is more than just the market when we are looking at our society, because that's to go back to the implication of the kind of economics we are used to. We are basically under a market framework, right? Everything happens through the market, and we are trying to kind of open that up and say, why? What if that's not the case? What if it's not just about a dichotomy between the state and market, but they are actually a part of our economy which has nothing to do with both? And trying to bring a discussion which also we've been actually getting to this because of this discussion of decolonizing economics, and have contacts with authors from the global south who actually had a totally different way to approach economics in that sense. So we're trying to bring that in. So in that sense, we want to also bring together different stream of economics that will identify themselves with this kind of definition.
So if I understand it right, and feel free to correct me here if I don't, but heterodox economics is in large part about broadening the field, and as you mentioned, bringing in a lot of areas that you feel are currently neglected by the mainstream, such as power dynamics, such as out of market activities, and others. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's definitely correct. And I like you brought that up because sometimes we start with this definition of heterodox economics, and we never get to a very interesting part of that discussion, which is not really a theoretical, a conceptual definition, but it's the idea of what actually, why this term exists in the first place. And I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about that because one thing is to look back in the history of economic thought and trying to kind of find out, well, when actually we heard about heterodox economics the first time, what was it about, and kind of trying to understand things, the historical aspect in a different way, which is, and again, we're following here an author called Frederick Lee, who actually did engage in that exercise. What he does is he looks back and he said, look, what's happening here is, in the same way that economics started kind of narrowing down its approach and methods, right? It started excluding other approaches, right? And of course, when that happens, the other approach, they were trying to find a home, basically, right? They're trying to get together with their mates, like, well, we're excluded from here, what we do? And so what we have, we can actually trace the heterodox term back to 19, I think 1863, whatever. But the way we that makes more sense for us is to look into how these different economists or community of economists start actually trying to find a home for themselves when they start being excluded from that process that started happening in the last century, where economics became much more narrow. So what happens was, we have, especially in the 1960s, in the 1970s as well, this kind of a creation, a formation of various different communities of economists, right? Who actually, they are not, none of them put their hands up to like, oh, I'm a heterodox economist. Not at all. They are not self-identified as heterodox, but they start really feeling, okay, we need a different home here. And so that's when we have in the US, for example, the creation of the Union of Radical Political Economy in 1968. You have the post-Keynesian economics starting in the US in the 1960s onwards. You have the institutionalist one, the Association of Institutional Thought, 1969, no, 1979, trying to revive itself. And probably at the time, I'm not so familiar with that, you also have Austrian economists trying to find their way through that journey. So I think what's happening, these communities, they're just popping because they're not finding their place. By the time we reach the 1980s and 1990s, is there when these communities of economists, they decide to kind of trying to get together, right? So let's see here, and that's when this broader umbrella of heterodox economics is starting actually popping up more clearly, right? So we have the International Confederation of Associations for Pluralism in Economics in 1993. You have the Association for Heterodox Economics in 1999, and others. So they start kind of getting organized to really also to survive in a way. And this is interesting because then we had to the 2000s start having conferences on heterodox economics, right? So it was in 2003 where we have the first World Conference of the Future of Heterodox Economics, which is amazing. So the thing is, and then of course one thing that's very important in that journey is by 2014 is when we start having a heterodox newsletter, right? Which is the most comprehensive newsletter you can get to trying to find out what's happening in the heterodox economic world. So of course the term was there. Okay, now a different exercise is to look into that and then trying to define what heterodox economics is. And that's where the confusion starts, it gets confused indeed, because you can look into these institutions and try to find institutional definition that actually show any kind of glue between these communities, right? And that is the first thing that people noticed was, okay, they are somehow trying to get together in opposition of the mainstream economic theory. And then that's when this definition, which I find a very poor definition for heterodox economics, that it pops up. It's like, oh, of course, the only thing this bunch of diverse communities have in common is being against or have an opposition to the mainstream economic theory and method. But I disagree with that, because I look at this rich and vast community of economists. They would exist regardless if the mainstream economics disappeared tomorrow. It is a matter that how they find their way to survive. And there are other economists such as Hodgson, who is an institutionalist, who look into that process, and he find a different glue for all these communities, which is apparently, from his perspective, the common point that is that all these economists, they have left oriented views. So, which is polemical, but here we go. So I think this is a way to trying to define the term. And I find, it's important for us, but we have to be very careful of how you take that heterodox economics is just about a bunch of left economists getting together, or it's just about the opposition to mainstream. So I don't know if I'm addressing your question directly, but I think there are two parts that we need to understand: how the term becomes popular. So from how we got into that point is about these communities of heterodox economists trying to get together, being very different from each other. And it's also about we as a research looking into this process and trying to work it out what heterodox economics is. And that's the difficulty. Is almost like, and here I'm following Lee's point as well, we're looking to a term that has multi-level, a kind of multi-level definition, right? So you have communities, you have the economic theory that is important, you have this institutional aspect, you have so many different multi-level aspects to consider, then it becomes very confusing to understand, but we shouldn't give up. All these definitions of heterodox economics, they are what we call a priori definitions, right? But there is a research now being done by Daniela Gizzo in Bristol, and Andrew Meerman has been doing that for a while, where actually they go and they ask if you consider yourself a heterodox economist. And that's an entire different level of confusion now, because we would look into some economists and classify them as heterodox economists. Then you go and you ask them if they are one, and they're going to say, oh, I'm not. So I think there are different, levels of difficulties here, maybe three levels of difficulties. One is how the term is this multi-level term. The second is this a priori aspect. And the third one I'm going to mention now is that this exercise of looking back in this term and trying to work it out what the term is has been done from different angles. So you have philosophers doing that. Then you have microeconomists looking to that. Then you have, macroeconomists that would say, oh, this is all about endogenous money. This also caused a difficulty to trying to understand that term. But I think we should insist, because basically for me, what that does is to show us that there are different ways to do economics. The objective of analysis is the same for all these economics, right, which is society and reality. This is our objective study, but there are different ways to do that, and we need to give space to all these different ways, because there is, unfortunately, we like it or not, no truth about reality. We don't have a final saying about what reality is. And I'm not just talking about pluralism in a very vulgar way. I'm talking about a process of investigation that literally gives space to competitive theories, theories with different explanatory powers, and you have to consider all of them.
So there has been some self-criticism from mainstream economics. Paul Romer wrote this article, The Trouble with Macroeconomics. You might think that behavioral economics is now pretty widely accepted, but used to be less so. What's the difference between those self-criticisms and the criticisms coming from heterodox economics proper?
Good question. Well, I do. I definitely think they're two different beasts. The criticism coming from heterodox economics and the self-criticism of mainstream economics are two different things. Let me start. I mean, I like to mention Colander because Colander is actually even before Paul Romer. He's the one who was really spending some time trying to map and explain the changes within mainstream economics. So it's an author that we all should read because it's interesting. I think there are criticism of economics coming from within, and I think they're good and interesting. But I think we should try to filter that from two different perspectives, right? The first one is the extent to which this within criticism actually are changing the research agenda, the teaching, right, in economics, the extent to which they're opening economics to different approaches, or in the case though to follow upon what we've been discussing, the extent to which they are opening the field to these different communities that were excluded before. So I think this is one point we need every time we see a criticism within mainstream, we need to consider it. And I think the other point is, the extent to which this criticism actually change core methodological and theoretical assumptions within the mainstream. I think this is a very important point. Are they challenging the mathematical deductivism, for example? Are they challenging the rational actors, the selfish individual behavior in terms of maximizing the individuals, maximizing their own interest? You really should think in that way, because then we can actually be sure if these criticisms are opening the field or are challenging the field in terms of a change of paradigm, a shift in paradigm. And to give you an example, and I think behavioral economics is the perfect example in that case, because yes, finally, the home economicus, a gente is being challenged, right? This powerful superhero that knows everything, he makes the best decision. Finally, we had a good set of tools to challenge that. And I like aspect highlighted by Dr. Ankara Haldar. She's at Cambridge as well, but no, I'm sure she's in the Faculty of Law, because I like when she says something along these lines, saying that this behavioral economics shown economists that first of all, human beings are inferior in a sense that they can't compute all this information. They don't have self-control. They can't make the best decision. In another way, it shows that human beings are superior in a sense that they are motivated by things other than this material self-interest. They're not robots, right? They are actually altruists and so on. And I think this is definitely a very important aspect of behavioral economics. However, we had 2 Nobel Prizes, because of behavioral economics. But the question is, has actually behavioral economics been able to change these core assumptions of economic theory? Right? So if you go back to some of Dr. Haldar's points, she's very clear that how mainstream economics, holding very firmly in this aspect of economic decision making, how it's still very mechanical, is still motivated by greed and selfishness, right? So instead of changing the paradigm of economics by challenge economic fundamental methodology, or by questioning some of the conceptions in macro and micro, basically behavioral economics is just applying their own, its own insights in terms of this nudging kind of work. So rather than bringing a revolution in the field, is kind of bring something like an extra, an incremental aspect, to kind of be very aware. Of course, I mean, we have to be very clear. I'm kind of simplifying a lot of the behavioral economics work now, and is a field that is flourishing at a speed that's amazing. So, we have to be very careful of what I'm saying. But at least for now, for the last 10 years, That's the way I see behavioral economics. And I'm not even go through to really discuss how behavioral economics is still very much the margin of the teaching process. Look at you guys here. Do you have a core course on behavioral economics? No, you don't, right? And that's Cambridge is no exception.
Can I see if I'm understanding that right? And I'm saying this as someone who doesn't know anything really about economics, but it sounds like what you're saying is economics has a bunch of models which you can use to understand different economic phenomena. And the criticisms that come from within mainstream economics, the self-criticisms, they go something like this. You take a model, say, the kind of rational choice theories of old, and see what it says. And for instance, rational choice theory used to say people act in line with their expected utility. Turns out that's not true, right? Because behavioral economics comes along and shows how people have different attitudes to risk than you might expect. And then what you do is you just tweak one of the things inside the model. So you're just changing it from within. And it sounds like the difference between the criticisms within mainstream economics and from heterodox economics is that heterodox economics is saying something like, well, maybe we need a different model entirely, or a different perspective, or another perspective. And that's what you're missing when you're just tweaking the parameters from inside that same model. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a very nice way to frame all this. We're talking about the same general models with this kind of some kind of behavior that move us away from what is considered the ideal kind of behavior, but we don't really get to challenge that model. We don't get into that discussion. So I think you're definitely right. And actually, when you're talking about that, it came to my mind to go back on Colander, because complexity economics is another fashionable thing to say how economics has been changing. And I think people actually that are not economists scholars that are not economists doing complexity, yes, probably they are challenging. But if you get economists such as Colander and Coopers, they have a very interesting paper on complexity in economic policy, has become very popular. The paper is said to be a paradigm shift in economics. But then you get a recent, actually read Alan Kerman, who is also an economist, a behavioral economist, no, a complexity economist, who was actually criticizing Colander's and Cooper's paper because he was saying, look, they're saying all this about complexity, okay? However, these two authors, they're not able to move away from the market equilibrium theory. They still stuck to that, which is actually a contradiction, an anomaly when you think in terms of complexity, because the complexity perspective, its own idea is that we can't converge to equilibrium. The only idea is that, you have a system that constantly evolved and its intrinsic dynamics may not really have a resting point, but they're doing, I recommend you guys to read Colanders, and you finish reading that, it's like, wow, this is a paradigm shift. But when you scrutinize what their framework, their models, they are not really challenging some of these core assumptions, in that case the market equilibrium theory. So I think you're right. I think the mainstream criticism is important, but is the internal criticism is very important, but we have to acknowledge the limitation of criticism, and also acknowledge that that is not what heterodox economics is about.
One interesting point that comes to my mind, and feel free to disagree with me here, but is the work by Piketty, which was hugely influential, caused especially amongst the public. But when you really look at what his work was, as for controversial as people believed it to be, the model he used was still very much rooted in those days.
Yeah, this is amazing. Piketty, in many others working with inequality, is a different aspect in what we're discussing. In what sense, economics actually has gone through an empirical shift. Also because of the data, because of what we have available to, the development in computers and etc. And this empirical shift, of course, we should welcome that. But this empirical shift has happened at the expenses of theory, of how we challenge theory. And again, the same old, the assumptions and so on. Because Piketty and many scholars following Piketty and working with inequality more specifically, they are very good at this empirical aspect, right? They're very good in this, how they deal with data. However, they do not get to challenge some of this, the mainstream theory. And they are in departments where they end up being welcomed because of that, because they're not really placing challenge in the kind of the entire structure of the department when it comes to research and funding, because they're doing the empirical work, they're adding to the department, but they're not really challenging, some of these theoretical aspects that if they actually go through that, probably would be a limitation, would hinder their own research, their own finding, to be very honest. My perspective is, and that's another polemical discussion, not only in economics, but also in social sciences more broadly. I don't think we can do, as social scientists, I think we do need theory. Is it possible to do just this empirical work without having a theoretical apparatus that is more coherent?
One area that I don't think we've touched upon yet, but I think is really interesting as well, is how the discussion of heterodox and mainstream economics fits in the public debate. As we've talked about, economics has these huge consequences for policy and real world application, and that means it's inevitably also a sort of political debate. You've kind of hinted about how one criticism of heterodox economics is that it's just a bunch of left wing people complaining. Could you elaborate a bit more about this and your thoughts on the kind of left wing, right wing divide?
Yeah, did I say that? Probably. Yeah, I mean, no, this is, oh gosh, is definitely a difficult question, and a question I'm still trying to work things out. Look, I do think this debate of heterodox versus mainstream economics is partially political. There is no way we can deny that. But I think I'm not sure if it's really a debate about left versus right wing political positions. I think there are many reasons why sometimes that is the case, but I would like to perhaps to talk a little bit about why this debate is political, but moving away from the left and right wing kind of discussion for now. We bring that to the end. Look, what we have here, we have two, as I said before, right? You have these two ways of doing economics. And I'm gonna simplify, but we have one way of doing economics, which is focus on the individual, as we know, is focus on choice, is focusing on self-interest in terms of achieving this social optimal. And again, to be repetitive a little bit, we're talking about this allocation of this efficient allocation of resource, which not necessarily equals to equity. That's something interesting for that economy. The solution that's efficient not necessarily is equitable, and we accept it in our models. So you have this economics, and then you have the other side, a kind of economics where, first of all, is economics that doesn't start with the individuals, right? That's not the starting point of that economics. Is economics that considered different groups' interests, different classes, basically, when it comes to distribution of resources. Is economics that does not really rely on this self interest approach, or even just on the market to theorize theorize society or the economy. Is a kind of economics that considered all the, as I said, the power aspect, cultural aspect, ethics, for example. And what that means basically is that we have two competitive two competitive approach to economy, to society, that are, in a way, as I said before, looking to the same object, and they are having different views on how different views regarding how wealth is created and how it's distributed. Basically, I mean, that will never end up well. Always is going to be political in that sense. We're looking to different ways to say have wealth creation, distribution. So I think by default this dispute is political. From my perspective, I think I see nothing wrong with this, actually. I think Economics is not a neutral discipline. I don't think it can be a neutral discipline. I don't think that if you go towards a path which I've been doing in the last 70 years to trying to make economics scientific, we'll somehow manage to make economics neutral, and that will be fine. Then you're going to be able to predict more accurately, and so on. I don't think this is possible. For me, markets and individualism, they are inherently incapable of taking into account what is a satisfactory distribution of resources. Basically, that's it. So for me, what that says to me is that there is a fierce dispute in this two approach, which by the end of the day will be political.
I have just a slightly annoying question, but in case people don't know, could you just clarify the difference between efficiency and equity? Why does orthodox economics only tell us about efficiency?
Let me start with the concept of efficiency first, and then we move to talk a little bit about efficiency versus equity. In mainstream economics, in orthodoxy, we have a concept we call economic efficiency. We learn that concept when we go through our microeconomics module. And this discussion is nothing else than the discussion of Pareto efficiency, which I'm sure you both are very familiar with. There are many points, many aspects we could go through to explain what Pareto efficiency is, but I think for our discussion, we can highlight only two. One is a situation in our economy in which the allocation of resources is such that if I change anything there, I probably cause a negative impact in someone else. Okay? Another aspect that is interesting to highlight here is that in that economy, if I decide to increase the production of one good, I will probably decrease the production of another good. Okay? So this is how our efficient economy is working, or should work. And here we are looking at production that we try to have the lowest total cost that's possible. And just, our observation here, this discussion of efficiency in that sense is really important and timely, because when we look at our current COVID-19 pandemic crisis, we can see that many scholars, policymakers, economists, they're highlighting how we're not prepared. We are not prepared for that crisis, how our economy is not resilient. And there are economists trying to explain that lack of resilience, looking back of how in the last 30 and 40 years we have organized both the private and the public sector around this concept of economic efficiency, where we have no spare capacity in economy, in a way. For example, the discussion of the lack of hospital beds in the UK, for example, has been approached or has been discussed, trying to understand the logic behind the organization of the public sector in the UK. And that discussion is taking economists back to that discussion of economic efficiency and etc. But that is a different point, not for now. So let's go back to the concept of economic efficiency. This concept has actually traveled many subfields within economics. One of them is the economics of public policy, where we look into the economic welfare of society. We look at social objectives in relation to economic activity, basically. And here we are trying to have an efficient level of output. And what we're doing is, our objective is to select a certain quantity of output for each good and service that will lead to that highest level of economic welfare. That's where we have a efficient level of output. Here, we're not really considering distribution, we're not considering what's fair or what is just. The idea of equity, the equity objective is not there, right? Is that what's happening? The logic here is that we're trying to select a level of output at which the excess of benefits over costs, that is the net benefit, is the largest. Okay, so I know I'm bringing a lot of things in. It's because that discussion, actually, to go through that discussion properly, we have to bring in the concept of total social benefit, total social cost, marginal social cost, marginal social benefit, and so on. But then we set our framework to reach this efficient level of output. But overall is that we want a level where the excess of benefits over costs is the largest. Now, as you can see, the notion of equity is not there. Why? I think the best way to explain that is if we go back to example that one of the textbooks use when we're teaching economics of public policy uses, which is an example where we have two members of society, basically Adam and Eve, and they are producing and consuming their own apple. So if when we go through our framework, we reach that total output of 10 kilos of apple per week, and that is where we have our efficient system, you can see how there are a number of ways in which we can divide this 10 kilos of apple between Adam and Eve. We can go for 5 kilos each. We can go for 5 kilos for Eva and 4 kilos for Adam, or 10 kilos for Adam and nothing for Eve. So there are many combinations at this efficient level of output, and we are not really considering what is fair. For us economists, actually, we are questions concerning the distribution of apples between Adam and Eve, they are matters of equity, but we are actually trying to look into the question of efficiency. And that's why I mentioned before that a solution that is efficient does not mean that it's a solution that's equitable. That's what I had in the back of my mind, in a way. I hope that was somehow helpful.
So if I could draw two key kind of lessons that you kind of mentioned about, which I find really, really interesting. The first one is this idea that economics is always inherently political, treating people as an individual, as you said, and also this idea of Pareto efficiency. These are value judgments and, do influence how we do policy, and is something that economics might have to do in order to work as a subject, but it's definitely something it should be more explicit about. And the second point that you raised, which I think is really interesting as well, is that it kind of doesn't make sense to focus on heterodox being left-wing and mainstream being right-wing, because these are more kind of two different frameworks that can lead to a different kind of policies and conclusions. And I think it's worth noting, maybe, as we kind of mentioned before with Piketty, that plenty of mainstream approaches can lead to left-wing arguments. You can also bring in Stiglitz or Milanovic and the like. And also you can look at heterodox economics and you can see some right-wing politics there. So we can discuss about Austrian economics and all the like. There are kind of two sides, and it's more about these frameworks and attitudes than it is about, neoliberalism is good versus neoliberalism is bad, which I often find, especially talking with a lot of, let's say, non-economics friends, is often the way it kind of gets categorized.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think, of course, the left and right wing debate is in there, but I agree. I think we have to be, it's not a, how to say, black and white kind of division. And I think somehow the point where you were touching as well is old discussion economics, which is the discussion which you guys also place that as a point for us to trying to unpack a little bit, which is the idea if economics can be value free, if economics can be apolitical, as you mentioned. I think Ha-Chun Chang in your first year undergrad, what he's trying to tell you is that you cannot, economics is by definition political. Exactly, as well, because of, I think Ha-Chun Chang goes more towards the debate of how we need institutions, how institutions are political, how we need the government, and how this will never actually allow us to separate economics from politics or from ideology. But there is one point I think perhaps if we have a time would be interesting to mention here, which is not really about is related to that, and I think is not enough highlighted, which is economics itself does trying to make this argument that is, value free. They, we go for this the whole debate between normative economics, and positive economics, and etc. And I think for me, one thing that perhaps you need to discuss is how this view of economics, the way we see and understand and theorize economics through the market equilibrium, how actually that approach has its own normative judgment as well, right? And how we don't really bring in that consideration, because when you're trying to make economics as positive science, you kind of blurred a little bit, you kind of hide a little bit this ethical and this moral aspect of economics, right? And then economists, they feel like they're not having a normative discussion here, they feel that they're fine, okay? However, for a field, okay, that is studying human behavior, that is studying distribution of resources, it can't never be actually free of these moral and ethical aspects. And when economists are actually saying, oh, here we go, we need this optimal place, we need to head to this kind of equilibrium, we need to, that's the way, the rational behavior, what is rational, what's commendable, that is a red, full of judgment, full of normative aspect, but is the no, the aspect that is, it shows actually a bias towards market process, towards equilibrium, which is associated with this social optimal kind of situation. But this can literally be said that it's also biased towards normative judgment, where we know we are always heading to a condition of equilibrium, to a condition where we especially in the case of the equilibrium, we're talking about these marginal returns, how agents will behave in that way. So we can't forget that economics, the framework we use, we should question, because perhaps the framework itself is also full of biases. And economists, they don't even realize that actually.
Just again to try and clarify, if I understand you right, it's not necessarily that economics is saying the market is good or the market is bad. It's rather the methodology that gets used to make that decision. And that's where we're challenging the bias and the values and everything that goes into that. And of course, that has an effect on what the end result is. And it is often the case that a lot of economists favor the market, but there's plenty, or I think every economist would agree, the market isn't always perfect and has got plenty of flaws and the like. But it's that methodology precisely that we use to reach that judgment.
You know what that makes me think of? I don't do economics, but in philosophy, we all got told to read this piece by Sen, Rational Fools. The point he's trying to drive home, at least for me, is that there are choices which are strictly rational from the perspective of this way of doing economics, which are just obviously not rational from the perspective of a sane human being. And that seems to be what you're saying as well, right?
Yeah, no, it's totally. So I mean, this is amazing. I mean, Sen is just like this guy, right? That we all should read. Economists, we must know what is economically good in our framework, right? And we are convinced to that, and you want the system to head to that, and you're going to defend this economic, what's economically good, the better position, the better equilibrium, and so on. And we can actually differ that from what we call would be a worse behavior, right? A worse economic outcome. So clearly we are judging things here. Again, to go back to Barbara Wooton, this Girtonian economist, she actually, when she discussing this topic, she came up with something she called the economic norm, the economist economic norm, that is always there, but no one discussed. We're just, but the norm is there, and that is normative. And that's why all the cards should be on a table. Economics is political, economics is ideological, ethical aspects are there, norms aspects are there. So if all the cards are on a table, we can have a much broader and deeper discussion about these issues.
And that links nicely as well to what Finn said about this efficiency equity kind of thing, where if you say you only consider efficiency and not equity because that's controversial and requires value judgments and the like, not considering equity is a value judgment in and of itself. There's no way you can be value free.
Wow, that's definitely a fantastic way to link with that is exactly that. I totally agree. Yeah.
So this has been a really interesting discussion about heterodox economics in the mainstream and all of these different thoughts and ideas. But what I also want to talk about is your work about decolonizing economics, and especially your involvement in that movement. Can you talk a bit about how you yourself are involved first, and then we'll unpack the ideas?
To start with this personal journey, I think, for me, as an economist, as a female economist, as a female economist coming from the global south, as a female economist coming from the global south with this Afro Brazilian kind of identity. I fell in Brazil in here, that this journey within economics has always been a bit hard. But I never really, it's interesting because I look back and at the time I couldn't really point my finger of what was happening there, if it was sexism, if it was racism or whatever. And I think as well, this is because of generations as well. I think now your generation is miles ahead in terms of discussing some of these topics more openly. So I wasn't sure. What I was, the feeling I had is that I always had to work harder. I had criticism that I look back and that wasn't fair, but I couldn't identify that was probably linked to something else. So I think my when I started sharing that, and that wasn't until I was doing my PhD in UK, I found out that some of the problems I was going through, they're not really my problems. They're happening to many other economists in my field. They're structural problems, and so any kind of the discrimination I was somehow seeing around me, or that I was experiencing, they were structural problems within our field. And it was interesting. Start like that was my own journey. Then I'm not an expert on that, but I start reading about these kind of things. So, has to be very honest, there is a good literature looking to how discrimination based on identity in economics happens. It has been largely documented. We have cases of how women face higher publishing standards, for example, than men. We have the situation of how women are less likely to be given credit if they co-author papers. We have so many papers looking to that and showing us this kind of discrimination. In the case of the UK, when it comes to race, we know there are no black actually academics in senior management position, for example. Black students are, I think, 0.5 or 1.3 times, I think, more likely to drop out. There are many. So you keep reading these papers and you start, okay, there is something happening in our profession. In going to conferences, I start meeting people who actually had the same concern than me. And that's how Decon came about. In a way, the more you share, the more you realize that people are having the same concerns you have, or going through similar experiences. And of course, the context of all this was the Me Too movement we had in economics. Right, because of, as we know, by 2017 or end of 2016, we have all this Me Too movement in Hollywood, the question of sexual harassment and etc. And that was somehow transferred to economics when the Alice Wu's paper come up. I don't know if you guys know that paper, where she was looking to the job market boom or job.
I'll link it on the show notes and then maybe edit it
Or maybe
in
we
here.
shouldn't just look off websites. But yeah, she was looking to that, and she was able to show, how actually there is a stereotyping of women in economics, and actually is economics is very misogynic, very hostile towards women. And then all this movement was happening in economics because then big names in economics, they had to admit that economics had a problem with women, right? So all this come together in 2017. The profession itself was kind of trying to come into terms with the sexism that paper actually had somehow exposed the entire profession. Many of us, we knew already, but that paper came up in a very important historical moment, and then that kind of gave us strength as well to put that movement together. But since the beginning, we're very sure that whatever the initiative we want to have to address sexism, to address racism in a profession, has to also bring together this diversity of approach. Because our criticism there is also about, if you don't, is a little bit what we've been discussing up to now. The economic theory can, in the same way, can be biased towards the market, right? It can also hide some of these aspects of society related to race, related to gender, or doesn't grasp that aspect. It's not just about adding a variable that represents gender, it's much more than that. So we are very clear that economics as it stands couldn't actually be if you don't change that aspect, you couldn't have economics that's more inclusive, that's more diverse. And I think this is where we came together, and we decided to have what we call this holistic approach. So is an initiative to promote inclusiveness in economics, but it's not just about identity. It's about content, is about institutional structures. And yes, we want economics that's free of discrimination, that that it doesn't have sexism, racism, but we also want economics actually that is more open to scholars that are not based in the US and the UK, and not open in terms of bring these scholars in and they have they work here for a while, or they see we use them in our syllabus for our course. We want them to be listened to. They are also engaging in theory. They also producing a rich kind of economics, and you students, you need to read them too, right? You can't just read textbook written by white men based in the US and in the UK. So we start thinking, okay, how we bring all this together, and that's basically decon. Is we say one without the other is not enough. So we're looking at more representation in terms of identity, more openness, theoretical and methodological aspect. And we're calling this engagement with the global south theory, this decolonizing economics, to trying to challenge the Eurocentric aspect we see in economics.
So, obviously, discriminating against a group or on the basis of someone's identity is just intrinsically bad for any number of reasons. But I guess also the field of economics itself is also losing out, because you're missing out in that way on this diversity of perspectives from those groups, right? This makes me think of this. I might be getting this wrong, but the role of women's work was neglected, and maybe is neglected for some time in the kind of formal models of economics, because it's often within the domestic sphere, right? And you might think one reason for that was because women were underrepresented in economics, or still are. So I'm curious, in what other ways is economics itself losing out in terms of the diversity of thought through its problem with diversity of identity, if that makes sense?
No, it does make sense, and actually is I have found out in a very hard way when having this discussion with scholars that are actually doing gender studies, how complex that discussion is. Because at the beginning of my journey, I was very much convinced, and there are papers on that as well, of how women or a black person would have a different perspective to economics. And you mentioned that, and it's true. This there are studies showing us that male and female, they have different tastes for policy. For example, different way to understand the intervention of the state in economy. Women are more favorable to interventions, or a different way to understand the provision of a health insurance for workers. So so I was very convinced that we need diversity, basically because that diversity would bring different ways to deal and understand economics. And I still very much think that that is the case. I think we need other minorities with different perspectives, and you definitely need the women with different perspective. But I think there are two things that we've been learning recently, and I'm really sharing with you guys things that very much work in progress in my mind, which is we shouldn't, first of all, stereotype that's just someone that would be more caring, that someone that would have this care economy, or it's just so if economics should be better, we need more women. I think is a burden to all of us, female, or however you identify yourself, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, to and be very into cliches, to make the world a better place. But and so this is one thing you should bear in mind. The other aspect is we can't by default think this will be better, right? I mean, we can see some criticism, for example, to when Theresa May was in Home Office or even as a PM. I mean, of course, this we get into politics a little bit, but people can criticize. We had a woman there and look at the outcomes. Or if you want to really make the end of this podcast very polemical, we can even mention Thatcher. I think we have to be very careful here of how we stereotype both minorities and women in economics. That said, I'm still convinced that the reason why for now we need to bring them in is because we need different ways to approach economics, different views. I mean, you can see with the Black Lives Matters, right? I don't know how close you guys are following this discussion, but I'm really into social media. I'm very active on Twitter. Every single tweet that comes with very strong arguments to why modeling is not giving enough attention to race or is not able to grasp racism come from Black scholars. Unfortunately, there is something related to our own personal history that give us different perspective of how we see the world, and we need that in economics. If you have economics that's just male, just white, we're gonna keep having more of the same, unfortunately. But in terms of examples, the way you ask, I think you gave a good example. The examples I had there had mentioned regarding health insurance and government intervention. But I think one interesting example here, which is something that it kind of escaped of our control, that I want to give, is that and that's not really about gender, but it's about this discussion on decolonizing economics and decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing university. There are several criticisms that how you want to decolonize a university that by default is elitist, is racist. It was created in the case in the UK, as you can see more and more often, how some of the universities, their history is very linked to slavery and slave trades and so on. So, people are saying it's almost like a contradiction in terms. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And recently, I read that book, which I can recommend you. I think it's Decolonizing the University, where one of the authors, she actually made analogy with the consequence that opening the university to women had after the 1960s. I'm so upset that I don't remember her name, because what she's saying is, these women start coming to university to learn, and they start noticing, well, that's not what happened. That's not what's happening from my personal experience. And her argument is that a lot of the feminism that we see in university, in theories regarding this part of the economy related to reproduction and care, would then be brought by these women going to university and realizing that what has been taught there wasn't really the reflect of what was happening in society through their own lenses, right? So I think of course, now we look back, so 60s, we're looking of almost 70 years after. Look at gender studies, look at feminist economics. We can't, so perhaps I can't give you an example, but I think this looking to the history of some of the implications and effects and outcomes of bringing women to universities can probably be linked to many benefits that my generation, your generation, and many more generations to come are having.
I'm just thinking of some examples and trying to link it to some of the other interviews we had as well, especially as you mentioned there at the end, feminist economics. I know one now, I'd say, mainstream concern that economics is certainly aware of is the idea of GDP, right? And I'm thinking of Waring's original book, If Women Counted, right, which I think is also one of the founding kind of documents of feminist economics, or an interview with Dr. Bateman and the family and the Industrial Revolution and all the like. I think, obviously, as you mentioned, there's definitely kind of a worry about stereotyping and that kind of argument. But there's also definitely current value judgments, as we kind of mentioned before, about what economics values as an outcome, and bringing in a broader set of voices that can challenge those value judgments as well is incredibly important.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is again well said. There are definitely some aspects we just can't predict, but we definitely should find a way to open the field for that, to give these minorities and women platform, so they can challenge what's out there. And also, one aspect in all these is also the class, the income aspect. To make economics the diverse is also about bringing, not having a universe that's very elitist, but having make it more democratic.
I find it really interesting that we have lots of really good examples from a few decades ago about how diversity of identity led to progress in terms of ideas. But you said, it's tricky to come up with an example off the top of my head of how that might play out nowadays. For instance, introducing more economists from the global south or something. And that seems really important, because you can only know these people's or those voices' contribution in retrospect, looking back, right? And that seems to be the point to me, that you can't tell it from within.
Just kind of follow up on that and ask about if you want to talk maybe very briefly about your own work on the global south and emerging economies and financialization and all that. Maybe just to give listeners who want to find out more about your work just a brief insight into what you're writing about at the moment.
Yeah, no, sure. So my research interest also end up kind of following my interest in economics, and in the case, as I said, the question of inflation, the question of some social issues in Brazil, but more through my journey, I think it became very clear for me that what I wanted to know more about was the macroeconomic aspects of economy, and that's why I got into macro development. And by the time I was going through my master, that was very clear to me that I was trying to understand development, economic growth, and the contradictions at that process. That's a good thing of actually having a BA from Brazil. By default, you're going to have to read the heterodox and structuralist Latin American school. So you get a very different perspective of what development is and the contradictions within the process of development. So you don't do just the solo model. And then what happened was I also started facing this limitation in my analysis, because the international aspect became very clear. That was a key factor there, that a lot of the countries such as Brazil, they would face some constraint regarding their own fiscal and monetary policy because of what was happening in developed economies and in the international financial and monetary system. And that's how I start actually looking into what the heterodoxy called financialization, and taking the risk of making many scholars very upset. I will call that, we can actually say that that's something similar than the financial globalization, that integration of the emerging markets or these developing economies with the international financial monetary system. And the reason why I'm saying scholars would be upset with me, because financialization is itself a broad thing to define, and is related to this increase of the financial transactions we start having in the last 30, 40 years. And for heterodoxy, this is an important term, because we're basically looking to finance and showing that finance has different dimensions that can cause crisis, that can impact in the distributional process. It's not just financing production. There's something else there. And if there's a development of finance in the way we've seen in 30, 40 years, you're going to have some implications. And developing countries, they get into the way I'm looking is how developing countries get into this process in the 1990s, some developing countries before, in terms of opening their financial and trade borders, and kind of trying to under the guise of promoting economic growth and development. But how when they jump into this process of financialization, they actually start facing even more constraint, because this process also shows a contradiction between a kind of finance that goes to production and a finance that finance most finance and is related to speculation and hot money and many other kind of flows of capital. So what I'm doing is saying, okay, if there is a problem here when you're looking into this international aspect, if you have something called financialization that it looks into this the financing in a more critical way, what's happening to the economy of these developing economies? How the macroeconomic effects on that economies? And in the case of my PhD, I was looking to Brazil, looking how the dynamics of the public debt changed because of this integration. Still trying to address the question if there is financialization in Brazil actually. This because the international aspect is okay, fine, but what's happening within the economy? So what I'm doing now in this postdoc is to carry on this investigation, but now opening up for developing countries more broadly, trying to understand how these economies they can keep up with this process of financial development. Again, seeing that in a more critical way, looking into the distributional aspects of that process. And trying to come up with some policy recommendations that it may be the case we do need capital controls, for example, for these economies to actually develop, to challenge a little bit the idea that access to finance by default leads a country to growth. Perhaps it doesn't. We need to kind of come up with a different theory for that.
So the first question we ask everyone is, what significant thing have you changed your mind about recently, and why?
There are probably many things I could say in a way, actually, I was thinking, but I wanted to focus on our discussion, discussion about heterodox economics, and actually about Cambridge and about left versus right-wing discussion. And I think somehow I have already said that, but for me, recently, the dichotomy I had between heterodox and mainstream left and right wing people was really bad before I got into Cambridge. I think working here, I realized that there's such more complexity into that. You look at this department and it's amazing to get to know professors and economists there. You never really would say they're right wings. And so I think this has changed. It has been not only changed me, but it has made me to rethink how actually I want to engage with mainstream economics and with economists that are actually doing mainstream economics. And the massive change, the implication of adding more complexity to that very black and white division I had before, was to get into read a little bit more. And we also discussed that a little bit. It was to unpack how you may very well have this more progressive view of society and politics, but your own methods, as we discussed, Luke actually summarized that very well before, how our own method in theory may have implications that actually contradict our own political views. So I think this is for me something that I had never, maybe it's obvious for social scientists, but as economists, I had never really thought in their terms. And I think another relate to that, something that contributed to that change in my mind was the elections around the world in the last 10 years, no, but let's say 5 years, because I came across many economists, some of them friends, who I would call heterodox economists, but they're they had a very conservative way to vote. a vote that ended up either in Boris here, or either in Trump in the US, or either in Bolsonaro's in Brazil. Which was like, a heterodox economist can't vote that way. So I think all this, it goes back to what Luca has already said. So I'm still processing this change. But yeah, it was something that was definitely significant change in how I see and deal with economics.
Got it. Okay, last question. What 3 books or films, articles, whatever, would you recommend for anyone interested in finding out more about all the things we've talked about?
For those who are interested in heterodox economics, I do think the starting point is Frederick Lee's book, which is called A History of Heterodox Economics. I think this book is amazing. Yes, it focuses on the US and the UK mainly. So someone needs to write a book about the heterodox thought in the global south. But it's a book that we need to, I think the discussion is amazing. And we need to understand why there are different ways to do economics. And I think that book can help us. A more recent book a book I've just really finished reading, and I can't even start explaining how that has changed me as a researcher. Is a book that is called Post-Colonialism Meets Economics. Is an edited book by Sharut Shila and Zain Eladdin. I can say the references if I'm not pronouncing that well. This book is just, especially in that historical context we are going through now, I think everybody should read. And to go back to all this market discussion, the equilibrium, the question of if there is this bias towards market, I would like to recommend a book that I started reading recently. I'm halfway through, but this has really impressed me. Is Matthew Watson, and actually the book called The Market. Before that, I would recommend reading Barbara Wootton's, which is a Gartonian I mentioned several times. She has a book called The Lament of Economics.
Carolina Alves, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me here. It was a pleasure.
That was Carolina Alves on Heterodox Economics, Diversifying and Decolonizing. As always, if you want to learn more, you can read the write-up at hearthisidea.com/episodes/Carolina. There you will find links to all the papers and books referenced throughout the episode. Finn and I always spend a lot of time putting this together and summarising the key points in an essay. We would be very grateful if you could leave an honest review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. If you have constructive feedback, there is also a link on the website to an anonymous form, or you can get in touch with us by emailing feedback@hearthisidea.com. We'd love to especially hear what topics you want us to cover next. If you want to support the show more directly and help us keep hosting these episodes online, you can